Hello, thanks for watching this October 4th, Wednesday West Weather Update brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. To start here, we're just looking at the last 14 days of precipitation anomalies across the West. I kind of set the stage for where we're going in the forecast, not only through fall, but we'll talk about El Nino and then going into winter. It's really been wet, certainly across the last 14 days. Really much of September across parts of the Northwest have been a bit wetter than average. I think starting the month there was concern about some of the southern summer drought, I should say, lingering in the Willamette Valley that was extending really across multiple areas in the Pacific Northwest. We've seen these periodic rain events come through. We just saw a big event come through this weekend here. Colder temperatures now trying to push across the area as a result of that. But you look into the areas like Great Falls, parts of the Snake River Valley, significant precipitation amounts, an inch or two over average for this time period. The Willamette Valley included in that, and even eastern Washington actually running slightly above average for the month as well. So good news in terms of getting drought, kind of staving off that concern, I think a little bit. We'll talk about the long-term implications of that. Perhaps, while it's been good news in that sense, workability, getting into the field, looking at windows in that sense, it's been a little bit more difficult. But overall, that kind of is where we're sitting in terms of that precipitation department, looking historically. Now, I want to take a closer look at some of the reservoirs, specifically across the Snake River Valley. It's kind of this time of the year in Idaho, some of those reservoirs hit their kind of annual peak and they start to level off near the bottom. American Falls being a big one that we look at, now down to about 18% full. The good news is it's started to fill up a little bit recently here with some of the rainfall that's come through. We're looking at hopefully some more rainfall, even just a normal water year coming into fall and winter. I think that would be good news for Idaho, kind of staving off some of the stream flow concerns. But at least right now, your kind of general El Nino forecast for the winter months there are actually going to be drier than average. Now, that's just kind of the textbook kind of correlation. Those aren't the strongest correlations. It's not a home run forecast by any means. I think there could be some other levers, could be some other players at hand here with the Northwest forecast that I want to talk about a bit. Some of these other reservoirs further up the valley doing pretty well. If we jump over to the Middle Snake River near Boise, Idaho, these doing well in the meantime. So I think we're kind of starting at a pretty good spot here, kind of going into fall. We'll just have to see where we go in that winter and spring forecast when we get the most of that rainfall and a lot of the snowpack built up that then melts into these reservoirs the next year. If we look at soil moisture percentiles, this is looking quite a bit down into the soil from that top layer and onward down. Really pretty wet across the board across the western U.S. This was a very different map. You might as well have put a lot of red on this map we were looking at near the end of last year. Really just the Willamette Valley seeing some of that kind of lingering drought issue there. But you pretty much go across the western U.S., most areas now above that percentile line for above average moisture, save for perhaps parts of northern Montana as well, which is still seeing kind of that lingering Pacific Northwest drought that we've been dealing with. And then just this past weekend, we saw another rain event come through parts of the Northwest, and we've seen kind of an upper level wind map or jet stream map that's looked, I think, similar to this in September. We had kind of this potent Pacific jet, but we were diving down these big, deep cutoff troughs here over the western U.S. that was helping to bring rainfall into parts of Idaho, parts of Montana, the Willamette Valley at times. Sometimes when we have these systems kind of screaming out of the Northwest, while they might bring inclement weather, rain, and wind to the coastline, they don't necessarily deliver on the waterfront. Certainly in the Willamette Valley, might get some passing showers, but you get over to eastern Washington, the Golden Triangle area in Montana, the Snake River Valley, it gets harder to bring precipitation in there with this more straight across, or what we call zonal flow. When you get these big amplified U-shaped troughs, that helps to bring in the rainfall a little bit easier just based on the orientation of the mountains out west. And that can even hold true as well in the Central Valley for some of these systems that come through later in winter. And I mentioned one thing I'm watching, well, that kind of background textbook El Nino forecast suggests warmer and drier across the Northwest. And if we're going to be in a strong El Nino, that would tend to be our forecast. And while it still is, I think part of that for now, one thing I'm watching is this cold patch of water in the Northeast Pacific. We kind of compared, I think a week or two ago, the 2015 very strong El Nino that didn't necessarily deliver on the precipitation front in California, Arizona, the Colorado River area and the basin. This area was quite warm. And we actually measured kind of this area of the Pacific in what's called the PDO, or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. We call it decadal because it tends to kind of swing or cycle on this decadal time series. And if you look kind of really at this area now, you can see that it's a little bit cooler, if anything warmer. Of course, we have this kind of warm patch north of Hawaii. We can see kind of the hints here of perhaps a negative PDO, maybe not developing, but at least trying to linger around here in fall. And I'm specifically watching this area in the Northeast Pacific as a way to kind of modulate what could be a drier or warmer forecast for the Northwest. I think if this stays cool, if it gets cooler going into fall, going into December, and then those spring water months, that could be a way to get at least maybe a more normal precipitation in for parts of the Northwest. That's something we're watching this year, kind of given that textbook background state of El Nino. Now, El Nino is measured down here. That's in the central tropical Pacific. You can also measure it in a few other areas. If you look at the eastern Pacific, we're quite warm over here as well. That's, we think has really kind of spurred the 2023 Pacific hurricane season here, where we've seen lots of storms. We'll talk about that in just a second. But kind of watching both of these players to see how that forecast might shape up, not only for the Northwest U.S., but even California and Arizona. I don't think it's a bad news right now. We're sitting here in October and we still see these cold ocean waters that we've been tracking, at least in this cold patch down here, for some time. Another way to think about this, if we look at that same ocean water, it's kind of that horseshoe I was drawing, that PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. By itself, it tends to correlate with El Nino. In fact, when we have an El Nino or warmer ocean temperatures in the central Pacific, we tend to see those warmer ocean waters extend kind of up the western seaboard or the eastern Pacific. And if you just correlate precipitation in the winter months across the U.S. over the last 50 years, the colors on this map are kind of switched around. We actually see when we have a positive PDO, or those temperatures are warmer in the eastern Pacific, we see more rain in California, more rain across Arizona, perhaps good news for the Colorado River Basin. I think what we're seeing there is really kind of the influence of El Nino. When we have El Ninos, we tend to have positive PDOs. But we actually can have some winters where we have an El Nino but don't necessarily have that positive PDO. And if we look at parts of Washington, Montana, Idaho, we actually see a negative correlation with precipitation with this positive PDO, meaning that, when these water temperatures are very warm over here, we tend to get less rainfall in the winter months in areas across the Northwest U.S. So kind of where my mind is going with this, I'm trying to figure out, if El Nino is going to continue to strengthen, but we don't see that positive PDO, is that good news for parts of the Northwest in terms of precip? I think it might be. Maybe not, a bountiful water year, but something where we're staving off, stream flow concerns, drought concerns for perhaps another year up here. As kind of an example to this, I'll pick on Boise, Idaho up here. This is looking at the year-to-date precip from this year. The kind of average amount of precip you get in Boise, Idaho is this curved line here. And you can see we've really been kind of right about on average this year, with some of the recent rainfall now jumping up above average. It's kind of why the reservoir situation is not looking too bad right now. But there are historical maps on this graphic here, and I'll point out one. 2018 and 2019 was kind of our last El Nino year out in the western U.S. And if you look at 2019, that's this green line here. And at least in the late winter and these spring months, we had a lot of water coming through Boise, Idaho in an El Nino year. And I think I just started this video saying, El Nino, we tend to be drier across parts of the Northwest. But I also, we had the disclaimer that it's just one correlation. It's not necessarily a home run in the forecast. And I bring this up because coincidentally that year we had something of a neutral PDO. In fact, maybe even a little bit cooler than average toward a negative PDO. And it might be that when we get more average or cooler ocean temperatures in the Pacific, we open up the door for a bit more rainfall in parts of the Northwest. Now, not every area in the Northwest is created equal. Certainly Idaho, Boise, Idaho, hours away from, Great Falls, Montana, or hours away from Salem, Oregon. If we jump over to the Golden Triangle of Montana, the southern side of it, they've had a very wet year down at kind of the bottom of that triangle. You go further toward the north, it's been quite a bit drier, kind of a tale of two halves of the side there. But if you look closely here, obviously this year above average, but if we go back and look at 2018 and 2019, both of those graphics, both of these rainfall years, at least in late winter and spring, were running above average. Again, perhaps because we didn't see this very strong PDO or warmer ocean water in the Pacific. And then I'll finish it with looking at a Willamette Valley station. This is Tangent, Oregon, kind of in the middle to eastern part of the valley there. Unfortunately, we can't necessarily extend these correlations all the way across the Northwest. Looking closer at this area here, we actually see 2018 and 2019 specifically running below average for the start of their, or the last half of their winter and the start of their spring there in 2019. So keeping an eye on this, I think it's one kind of wrench that might be thrown into that long-term forecast. At least right now, the seasonal drought outlook from the Climate Prediction Center was updated just a few days ago here. Has drought persisting across much of the northern Northwest. That includes parts of the Willamette Valley, includes parts of that northern Golden Triangle. The kind of good news is we don't see that here persisting in parts of the Southern Triangle and parts of the Snake River Valley in eastern Oregon here. Jumping forward here, looking at the tropics, I think, I've mentioned in the last two videos that one area we're going to keep an eye on was the far eastern Pacific, as the MJO, or this kind of convecting, producing area of the equator that was kind of moving toward the eastern Pacific, was going to land somewhere here in the early part of October. And we've seen kind of slowly ramping up of tropical activity here. And if we look closely, here's Tropical Storm Lydia. Here in the Eastern Pacific, this developed just here recently, and we're watching another potential area of development down here where we see this complex of thunderstorms. So seeing some tropical development ramp up. Lydia is expected, you can kind of see it to mosey its way westward. Does not have a lot of organization now, so not a surprise that it's not at that hurricane status. It's dealing with some easterly wind shear right now. That's expected to continue as it moves toward the west. Not expecting kind of any imminent rapid strengthening. But there's also not a ton of steering flow in the area. And what we mean by that is doesn't really want to go anywhere right now. It's I think going to stick around somewhere here in the Eastern Pacific, where perhaps getting out into Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday of next week, it might change its mind in terms of that development and become a bigger storm. We'll also have to watch the storm that could potentially develop toward the east. It could have some strengthening as well as the MJO moves further over the Eastern Pacific and makes this area a bit more conducive for tropical development. Looking closely at the Tropical Storm Lydia forecast, this is from the National Hurricane Center, the experts on these sorts of tropical systems. There's that kind of very slow movement toward the west. In fact, here it is on Wednesday morning and Wednesday afternoon, and we go all the way out to Monday, only expected to move a bit toward the west off the coastline of Mexico here. So we'll have to keep an eye on this one. I think might even be talking about Lydia all the way at the next video next Wednesday to keep an eye on what it is doing. I mentioned that system potentially developing toward the east. We'll look at the ECMWF, the European model, to get an idea of where we might be going with both these storms through the weekend and into next week. And I'll take this forward into Thursday, into Friday. See Lydia trying to develop, really struggling to get any organization. But then by Sunday evening, over the weekend here, we have another potential tropical storm developing toward the east of that. Now, the GFS is a little different. I won't show it here kind of in the interest of time, but it actually has Lydia strengthening quite a bit early next week into potentially a more significant hurricane, and has this one a bit weaker. The ECMWF has been kind of in reverse of that, has this storm here to the east developing a little bit faster, maybe into a weak hurricane before making landfall in Mexico, and Lydia kind of weakening and drifting out here in the Pacific. So we'll keep an eye on here. I don't think there's many implications here for the western U.S. just because they're kind of staying in the eastern Pacific. Nonetheless, we'll keep an eye on them. Hopefully have an update for you next Wednesday. I think the bigger news, certainly over the next 7 days, with the MJ moving over toward kind of phase 8, phase 1 into areas of the eastern Pacific, we tend to expect more inclement weather and more kind of progressive systems. That is, shifting warmer and then shifting cooler, shifting drier, then shifting wetter. And I think we've seen that. I talked about the system here this last weekend that came through. If I take this forecast, this is looking at the jet stream level pattern over the western U.S. right here on Wednesday afternoon. We can see a trough over the central part of the U.S. that's going to help bring temperatures down in parts of central and eastern Montana. But kind of the bigger news here for this next weekend is this upper level ridge. Those tend to correlate with heat and dry weather. That starts to become the dominant feature over the western U.S., really the whole western U.S. by Saturday midday. So we can see that upper level ridge here over the western U.S. would expect warmer temperatures to start to move into the area at the end of the week. Ultimately, then we'll take this out through Sunday, overspreading parts of Montana and Idaho on Saturday and Sunday. Before Monday, we start to see our next weather maker coming out of the Pacific with this extended Pacific jet stream coming up into a trough off British Columbia, kind of your textbook big weather fall maker for parts of the Pacific Northwest and even parts of Northern California as well. Forecast getting out a few days now, but we can see a big, potent upper level trough moving into parts of Washington, Oregon, Northern California, Nevada. If we take this out just a few more days, we can see this trough really opening up. This would bring quite a bit of rainfall to western Montana, maybe even parts of Idaho as well. So again, far out in the forecast now, all the way out to next Wednesday, but decent confidence. We're going to have some system move through late Monday, pushing into Tuesday, bringing temperatures down across the western U.S. I think that includes parts of the Central Valley, at least the Sacramento Valley, certainly. Of course, this time of the year, we got to keep an eye on freeze. We're getting into October. We had some of these troughs move through in September, and I kind of gave the friendly hint that, we're not going to be too worried about freezes in mid to late September typically. But as we get into October, that changes a bit. So I'll start with the maximum temperature anomalies. These are the daytime high temperature anomalies for the west to get you a sense of how things might feel compared to the seasonal average. And you can see temperatures warming up today on Wednesday afternoon across western parts of the west region. If I take this through Thursday, warming up as this ridge again becomes the dominant player this weekend. By Friday, the Willamette Valley, the SeaTac area getting quite a bit warmer. And then finally by Saturday, with that ridge dominating the flow pattern across the western U.S. Now Montana joins the party, the Central Valley, all the way down through the lower Colorado River Valley, essentially the entire region. Continues on Sunday until Monday. The influence of that next active weather maker, that trough, starts to come into the west. And then Tuesday, that starts to overspread the region a little bit more. We'll see if they have the Tuesday in. They do. which would pose typically a little bit of freeze concern, but with rain and clouds kind of sticking around, that tends to keep a lid on overnight temperatures, at least in the other direction, or at least a floor, I should say, on overnight. That would be the correct analogy. So I'm not too concerned for freeze and frost in parts of the Willamette Valley. One area where frost perhaps isn't as big of an issue would be parts of western Montana, and we are, with this kind of last trough that had just come through moving out of the area. We'll see if I can pull that back. Let's see if this run is in. We are expecting some... No, I can't get that one to move. We are expecting some frost in this area, perhaps Thursday or Friday morning in the kind of Great Falls up to Havre and the Golden Triangle area here. And I believe that would be their first frost of the season if it hasn't already occurred. We'll see one more time if I can get these overnight minimums to come up, and I cannot. But right now, temperatures expected in the Willamette Valley, parts of eastern Washington, parts of the Snake River Valley, not too concerned with freeze with that next system next week. We'll jump over to the ECMWF, see if we can get temperatures from that run here. I'll show you what I'm talking about. There's the potential freeze on Friday morning across the Golden Triangle area. Fortunately, the Snake River Valley not as cold. If I take this into the next week, Monday and Tuesday, when temperatures now cool down across the west proper, Willamette Valley still in the 40s, parts of eastern Washington still in the 40s, parts of the Snake River Valley in the low 40s. So at least right now, not expecting a big frost or freeze out of this next system, and I think part of that is the clouds and the rain that are sticking around with that. So that can be a good news at times. We'll have to keep an eye on frost and freeze going forward. It's also possible, given how far out this forecast is, 5 to 7 days, that if the system trends a little bit more potent, perhaps frost does start to become a concern, but we'll get a update out here if that were to change. As far as rainfall, this is looking kind of at a rolling 24-hour window of precipitation across the western region, potentially seeing some showers move through the Golden Triangle area here this afternoon. But as we go through the weekend, not a surprise that things are going to dry out with that upper level ridge and those warmer temperatures dominating. I'll take that through this area quickly here. And you can see we essentially go blank across the western region this weekend. That's to be expected with a big upper level ridge like that. And then, of course, by Monday evening, Monday afternoon, we start to see the first kind of effects of that upper level trough and the low pressure system associated with that moving into the west. I think by Monday night and then getting into Tuesday morning, the Willamette Valley could see some significant precipitation, talking an inch or more of rainfall over a 24 to 48 hour period. And I think we do get some rainfall into parts of the Sacramento Valley of California. The ECMWF model specifically here showing about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more in spots. I think that's possible. How far south this gets, I think is kind of up in the air, whether it's something kind of on even the northern half of the Sacramento Valley versus the whole valley down to Sacramento itself, I think is up in the air. Anytime you're talking about a 5 to 7 day forecast, it's hard to get specific with that. But we do see widespread rainfall across the Pacific Northwest, even into parts of eastern Washington, perhaps into the Snake River Valley. And if it does curl up, at least like the ECMWF is suggesting, and we get some of that kind of southeasterly wind, I think western Montana is in for even more rainfall as well, for an area that's seen quite a bit of it here over the last 14 days where we started the video. So that's the forecast going forward. The MJO, as it's kind of moving into the far eastern Pacific here over the western hemisphere, the forecasts, at least right now, suggest it kind of wants to linger in this area. We know when this is moving quickly like it was recently, it tends to keep the pattern moving or progressing. We get these troughs, we get rain, and then like we see this weekend, here comes the upper level ridge. That brings warmer temperatures, drier conditions, and then right after that, right, we shift back into the opposite pattern. We're cooling down. We're talking about the potential for frost and freeze, and then certainly a lot of rainfall for parts of the Northwest and even parts of Northern California. That's with kind of an active progressive MJO moving across the Pacific. So that makes sense. But if it slows down here, like the ECMWF, the European model is suggesting, and wants to park somewhere in 8 and 1 over here in the Western Hemisphere, we could be seeing kind of a slowdown in that kind of progressive pattern trend there. So keeping an eye on this, typically kind of 8 and 1, we expect more inclement or cooler weather across the Western U.S., all things average. If we looked at the 6 to 10 day outlook from the National Weather Service, not a surprise to see the upper level ridge kind of dominating the eastern part of the West region, so that kind of moves out of the area next week. This is really looking out into the next work week. And not a surprise here to see a big bullseye of above average precipitation expected across the Pacific Northwest, even extending over into western Montana, parts of northern California, and even starting to kind of sneak in here to the San Joaquin Valley. We'll see how far south that rainfall gets. It's not out of the question that we could get some showers or measurable rainfall as far south as Fresno in that area. If we take this out to the 8 to 14 day outlook, if we look at temperature trends across the western U.S., really getting out into the end of next work week and next weekend, We see temperatures perhaps trying to rebound, but still kind of seasonal up in the northwest. We still see this kind of general above average precipitation trend across the Willamette Valley, parts of Washington, Montana, and Idaho. I don't think we're going to see a seesaw of a pattern in the middle to late part of October. If we do have that MJO stalling in the Eastern Pacific, we'll have to keep an eye on that as we go forward. We did get a new monthly outlook for October here from the National Weather Service before the last time we talked. I did mention that a typical kind of El Nino forecast, we tend to be drier and warmer in the northwest region of the U.S. We see some of that here with warmer temperatures expected here for the month of October. The dryness is here, at least in this forecast, more sort of centered over the very far Pacific Northwest. We actually have wetter conditions now overspreading parts of Nevada and Southern California, parts of Arizona, perhaps indicative of a re-strengthening here of the subtropical jet. So we'll keep an eye on this going forward. I don't think this is a huge surprise kind of considering where we're at with El Nino developing. We'll keep an eye on the long-range forecast going forward. Those are just some of the things I'm watching here this Wednesday evening. Thank you all for watching. Talk to you next time.